It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the morning, Congressman Matt Gaetz from Florida's 1st District. He is serving his 2nd term. His work has focused on a lot of issues: national security, tax reform, clean energy, regulatory reform, and adherence to constitutional principles. This year, he introduced the Green Real Deal resolution as a conservative response to the Green New Deal, which we were hearing about in the last panel. He's a passionate warrior, making sure the government is accountable, transparent, and honest. So I'm pleased to welcome him on the stage. Welcome, Congressman Matt Gaetz. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you.
I'm your last speaker before lunch. I've been in somewhat a similar position before. My dad was in politics, something that Senator Romney and I have in common. And my dad was going to speak at a rodeo, but he was late. It was like one of those real hot days in Florida, dust in everybody's throat. And I was about 12 years old. My dad was running for the school board. And the rodeo caller got into the center of the ring and said, "We'll now hear from Matt Gaetz, and as soon as he's done, we'll have the cold beer." And I learned then not to stand too long between an audience and what they really want. Though it is an honor to be here with you today, to address a topic of such vital importance to the safety, security, and the beauty of our country and the world, that is the threat of climate change and what we must all do to stop it. And let me be clear from the outset, climate change is here, it's happening, and it is real. I'm known in this town as somebody who can take up a lot of arguments and go make them forcefully, but I did not get elected to Congress to argue with a thermometer. I'm a proud Republican, and I agree with the scientific consensus that human activity contributes to this problem, and more importantly, I agree with the moral consensus that we must do everything in our power to stop it. Earlier this year, the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary of the Army, the Chiefs of Staff of both the Army and the Air Force testified before the House Armed Services Committee that in real time, climate change is affecting the strategic decisions that our military makes regarding weapons testing, basing decisions, the global movement of humans, and high-stakes territorial claims made by our adversaries in the Arctic. These are not arguments emanating from some Los Angeles vegan drum circle. They're not arguments that are made exclusively on the editorial page of Mother Jones magazine. This is a warning coming directly from the top brass of the United States military, the most lethal fighting force in the world, and thank God for them. Not only is climate change directly relevant to our national security, I will argue that it is relevant to our nation's border security as well. If you think the situation at the southern border right now is chaotic, imagine in the not too distant future millions of climate refugees putting additional pressure on our nation's border, creating a global playground for terrorists and traffickers. We see this happening now in the Northern Triangle. It should not be an argument we have to make so frequently that if you can't grow stuff, people will leave and move. And when they move, that erodes borders and nation states, and it creates a permissive environment for people to do very bad things. In fact, it might come as a surprise to many here, though it makes perfect sense, that many of the prominent environmental organizations in this country at their founding held immigration views that were quite similar to the views held by President Trump. The concern was that unchecked immigration and open borders could put unsustainable pressure on the nation's environment and resources. Securing our environment from existential threats is something we might refer to as environmental security, and it is essential to securing both national security and border security in the long term. And I make these points because these are issues that Republicans care about. Republicans who ignore or dismiss climate change, therefore, are not merely defying scientific consensus, they are sabotaging the long-term success of their own stated priorities. Climate change is a real problem, but real problems require realistic solutions. And that's where I fear my Democrat colleagues have fallen far short. At present, the best-known Democratic proposal to tackle climate change is AOC's Green New Deal. Say goodbye to cows, cars, airplanes, and hello to $93 trillion in new spending. Of course, the Green New Deal was never intended to be a serious proposal. Even its own sponsors ultimately refused to vote for it. It does, however, embody the regulatory impulse that is typical of the far left's approach to solving problems. The regulatory approach favored by the far left is not only unimaginative and unrealistic, it is counterproductive. Throwing more regulations at the problem simply ensures that we will outsource pollution-causing jobs overseas to countries like China with substantially worse environmental protections than our own. In other words, Democrats' plans would not only destroy the American economy, it would fail to reduce global emissions. In fact, the Green New Deal would probably increase global emissions since polluting industries would merely outsource their jobs to other nations. Power-hungry politicians and special interests in the United States may benefit, but the American economy and the global environment would suffer. The notion of fighting climate change unilaterally by disarming our economy is so absurd and counterproductive that it is sometimes unclear whether these priorities were written by politicians in the United States or by Chinese lobbyists themselves. What America needs is a realistic approach to a real problem, a Green Real Deal, something linked to legislative proposals that can gain broad bipartisan support. Instead of leaning on more regulation to address climate change, my Green Real Deal draws upon the precious natural resource that is in happy abundance in our country, and that is the innovative spirit of the American people. It might come as a surprise to some, but the president has already laid foundations for an effective approach to climate change as a consequence of his tough approach to China, not only on trade, but also on the issue of intellectual property theft. For decades, special interests and the establishment in charge would sit back idly while jobs, livelihoods, and entire industries were outsourced to China. Air does not know borders. Meanwhile, our one-sided trade relationship with China has built up China's economy and increased global pollution, both at the expense of America's working people and industrial base. What's worse is that China's systemic plunder of American intellectual property has eroded the incentives for innovation, including innovation relevant to our climate change crisis. America's solar technology once led the world. Photovoltaic solar was a uniquely American enterprise. So what happened? China stole this intellectual property, replicated our products overseas, and undercut the American solar energy worldwide. I am grateful that the president put $50 billion in punitive tariffs on China as a consequence of their improper actions, and I believe that we could have a pollution tariff that would be embraced by the president, his allies, and potentially those on the left who would like to see more responsible and effective approaches to climate change. The president's tough approach to China's abusive trade practices roll back our previous policy of subsidizing Chinese pollution on the back of American workers. It isn't just China that's been holding us back from realistic solutions to climate change. In many ways, we are our own worst enemy. We have no excuse for not modernizing our electrical grid. The American Society of Civil Engineers rates our current electric grid a D+. Today's grid cannot even handle our existing portfolio of renewables. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory argues that just today's renewable energy technology could be coupled with an updated electric grid to result in renewable energy meeting 80% of America's energy needs by 2050. That is realistic, that is doable, and there is no reason Republicans and Democrats should disagree on the issue of investing in an electrical grid that can be used by anyone. And this has a very distinct departure from the crony capitalism policies of using government as a venture capitalist to try to go and get ingrained with a specific company or a specific business model. An electric grid is a platform that can be used by all innovators. The Green Real Deal recognizes that we have to convert the electric grid from a platform to a platform and away from the bottleneck that it is now. Another platform for innovation includes the 640 million acres of federally owned land. Why not harvest more renewable energy from this space and allow the bounties of our beautiful land to contribute to their own preservation? There is excellent bipartisan legislation on this very question now by Chairman Grijalva and Representative Gosar, and I believe if we were serious about climate change, we would find solutions like the Grijalva-Gosar legislation and unlock the great potential that is evident in our federal lands. I've often described the Green Real Deal as a love letter to the American innovator, and I'm proud to say that the innovative approach favored by the Green Real Deal would drastically reduce the most environmentally unfriendly material known to man, and that is red tape. Today, the cheapest and cleanest energy comes through hydropower. Pro-hydropower agendas could cut through red tape, reduce costs for consumers, along with carbon emissions. The greatest threats we have right now to our hydropower are state and local regulations that stand in the way of this clean energy. And if we are to have a truly nationalist policy on clean energy, we can unlock the great potential from hydropower. And if you don't believe me that it's the cleanest and cheapest energy around, go ask a Bitcoin miner. Those people need energy like nobody's business, and they try to co-locate with hydropower as frequently as possible. The Green Real Deal would also reduce constraints on zero emissions nuclear innovation, particularly where we can replace dirty coal. Currently, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission favors these big light water nuclear reactors. And I get it. If I was in the business of building $40 billion light water nuclear reactors, I would probably want federal policy that made people buy $40 billion light water nuclear reactors. But that doesn't mean it's what's best for our country. Instead, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission ought to consider smaller, more reliable modular nuclear reactors that can be built at a fraction of the cost, which would expand the ability of nuclear power to meet the needs of rural communities. Modular nuclear power would also be invaluable to our military bases, something I care about. I represent more troops than any other member of Congress. I'm very proud of them, and I believe these energy issues can be lashed to our national security strategy. Because when we take bases off the grid, the electric grid will be less attractive as a target for hackers and those who would do us harm. Nuclear energy is clean, effective, and safe. People point to Chernobyl as the reason that they don't support nuclear energy in the United States today. Frankly, I would not use a toothbrush made in Russia in the 1980s. And I think we've come a long way since then, and I think the technology would make the case for broader use of nuclear. And it is unfortunate that my colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, has not included nuclear in her legislative proposal on climate. That should be an area of broad agreement. President Trump has made history by addressing the needs of the forgotten women and men in rural America, and I think it's up to us to build on this achievement, democratize nuclear to our rural communities, and allow American companies to capture the global modular nuclear market. We are missing out on so much of that market now globally because we're not doing enough domestically to build out the capability. The ideas I've put forth in the Green Real Deal are just a start, but they're an important and necessary start toward innovative, realistic solutions to address the very real and urgent problem of climate change. Like so many of the most important challenges we face, one of the big threats are the stale political dogmas and divisions of the past that have not allowed us to understand, much less solve, climate change. Young people of all ideologies and persuasions understand the importance of getting it right on climate because it is their futures that are most at stake. And, I know the country was quite taken by the testimony before the UN of the young lady who I think really created a viral moment. And, when she sits there and says, "How dare you," to a bunch of world leaders, it's something we pay attention to. But my question is, how dare the leadership in the House of Representatives where I serve not advance the stuff that we all agree on first? It is so frustrating to me to watch the polar ice caps melt while this town remains frozen. And I sure wish that we could get climate activism off of the intersection between K Street and 16th and instead get that activism onto the floor of the Congress. And it's not like we've got to come up with new bills to do it. There's an existing portfolio of legislation that falls within the priorities and values of my Green Real Deal that could do a lot to solve the problem. Protecting our environment is not an issue of left versus right. It's an issue of clean versus dirty, healthy versus sick, beautiful versus ugly. It's conservative in the most essential, nonpartisan, and literal sense of the word, conserving the resources and the splendor of our natural world. America is often lauded as more than a country. It's an idea. But I would say it's even more than an idea. America is our home. The oceans and rivers and forests and streams and meadows and hollers of this country are a tremendous resource that we want to preserve and enjoy for generations to come. It is time to unleash the creative genius in this country to protect our national treasures, and in doing so, secure America's greatness, prosperity, national security, border security, and beauty for generations to come. Thank you all so much for being in the fight with me. Let's go get them.